The zip tie was already cutting into my wrists when the man crouched down to explain, slow and patient, like I was slow, that nobody in this county was going to miss one broke-down horsewoman with a mortgage she couldn't and oppose. Pay. I didn't and oppose, answer him. I was counting instead 3 men, 1 truck, 1 exit through the hay door, 1 through the main aisle, and while I counted I let my shoulders drop and my hands go loose inside the plastic, the way you do when you and oppose. We been taught that panic burns oxygen you and oppose. I'll need later. The man watching me frowned at that. He didn't and oppose. Know what to do with a woman who wasn't an oppose. Scared. He kept glancing at the puckered white line of scar tissue that ran along my left forearm, the one I usually kept hidden under a leather cuff, and something about it made him take half a step back without seeming to notice he and oppose. Done it. To understand how I ended up zip-tied to a hitching post in my own barn, you need to go back 9 days, to the morning the county courier truck pulled up my drive with a certified letter that would have ended most people and oppose's lives as they knew them. My name is Nora Callahan. I and oppose. Am 44 years old. For 11 years I served, the last 6 of them teaching close quarters combatives to Army Rangers and later working private security details in places the State Department doesn't and oppose. Like to name out loud. When I finally hung it up, I came home to Willow Fork, Kentucky, took over my grandmother and oppose's 40 acres and turned it into 6 Oaks, a non-profit horse rescue running on donations, volunteer labor, and whatever I could still coax out of my own savings. We had 31 horses that spring. Most of them had been starved, abused, or abandoned before they came to me. I understood them better than I understood most people. The letter said 6 Oaks owed $22,400 in retroactive permit fees and legal costs within 9 days, or the county would revoke our nonprofit land use variance and shut down the only water access that served 40 stalls. I read it twice standing in my own driveway before I understood what had actually happened. My new neighbor had filed it. His name was Colton Briggs and I had met him exactly once. He and oppose. Bought the old Hargett place 2 months earlier, 60 acres bordering mine on the east side, the deed his father and oppose's construction money had paid for in cash. He was 29, built like something out of a protein shake advertisement, and he and oppose. Shown up at my fence line on a Tuesday afternoon wearing a tight black rash guard with the logo of Ironclad MMA stitched over the heart, the local gym where he trained and I would later learn half-owned. And quote, you and oppose. Re the horse lady and quote, he said before I and oppose. Even reached the fence. Not a question. He said it the way you and oppose. Point out a stain on a carpet. And quote, Nora Callahan and quote, I said and put my hand out anyway. He looked at it like I and oppose. Offered him something used. And quote, yeah. Listen, that easement you and oppose. Got running water off my property line, that and oppose, ending. I and oppose. Am putting a training facility back there. Octagon recovery pool, the whole build. Can and oppose. Have livestock churning up my access road. And quote, that easement and oppose. Been recorded since 1961 and quote, I said. And quote, it and oppose. Not something either of us gets to end. End quote. Something shifted behind his eyes, quick and cold, gone almost before I caught it. And quote, we and oppose, LLC and quote. He said and smiled with all his teeth, and walked away like the conversation had already gone exactly the way he wanted. I should have known then. I didn't and oppose. I went back to mucking stalls and told myself rich men make empty threats all the time. 6 days later the letter came, and I understood it hadn't and oppose. Been empty at all. It had been a promise filed through a lawyer his father kept on retainer, built on a technicality about my grandmother and oppose's original variance that nobody had bothered to correct in 60 years because nobody had ever needed to. Colton Briggs had found the one crack in 60 years of paperwork, and he had used it to try to drown me. I called the county the next morning. The woman at the permit office was kind but useless. The file had come from the commissioner and oppose's desk directly, she said, already stamped, already moving. I called a lawyer in Lexington who quoted me a retainer bigger than my monthly feed bill. I called my volunteers, 6 of them, mostly retired school teachers and one 19-year-old named Priya who mucked stalls on weekends for the credit hours, and told them the truth because they deserved it. If I couldn't and oppose, fined $22,400 in 9 days, 6 oaks might not survive the month. Priya cried. I didn't and Oppose. T let myself. That afternoon Colton and Oppo's truck idled at my gate for 11 minutes, engine running, windows down, 2 of his gym buddies laughing in the cab with him while he filmed my barn on his phone like it was already his. When I walked down to ask him to leave, he lowered the camera and looked at me with an expression I would come to know very well over the following days. Not anger, something worse, a kind of bored, satisfied contempt, like he was watching an animal finally understand it was caged. End quote. You shouldn't Oppose. Vi just given me the water rights, end quote, he said. End quote. Wouldn't Oppose. Vi been cheaper for everybody, end quote. End quote. Get off my property line, Mr. Briggs. End quote. End quote. It and Oppose. S a public road, sweetheart. End quote. He grinned. End quote. Free country. Free county anyway. Long as you can afford the permits. End quote. He drove off laughing, and one of the men in the cab, younger, thinner, a kid really, maybe 22, glanced back at me through the rear window with something that might have been shame. I filed that away. It would matter later. That night I found the water trough in the north paddock had been drained, valve wrenched wide open, 600 gallons soaked into the dirt by morning. No proof it was him. No proof it wasn't Oppose. T. Deputy Marisol Ruiz came out and wrote a report and told me gently that unless I had a name and a witness, there wasn't Oppose. T much the department could do. She looked tired saying it. I got the sense she and Oppose. D said the same sentence to other people about other things involving the Briggs name more than once. Over the next 4 days the pattern repeated itself with the patience of a man who had never once in his life been told no and made it stick. A section of fence cut on the east pasture. My geldings scattered half a mile down the county road before Priya, and I herded them back at 5 in the morning, both of us soaked through and shaking. A dead possum left deliberately across my mailbox. Loud diesel generators run all night at the property line, close enough that my horses paced their stalls bug-eyed and sleepless, which for rescue animals with histories like theirs was its own kind of cruelty. I documented everything. Cameras, timestamps, photographs of tire tracks that matched his truck and Oppo's aftermarket tread. I called Deputy Ruiz again, and this time she came out personally and stood in my kitchen looking through the folder I and Oppo's built, jaw tight. End quote. This is a pattern, end quote, she said. End quote. I can see it and Oppo's a pattern. End quote. End quote. Can you do anything with it? End quote. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything about how deep Briggs' money ran in this county. End quote. The commissioner who signed off on your variance review, end quote, she said quietly, end quote, is on the county code board with Colton and Oppo's father. I and Oppo's am not saying that means anything. I and Oppo's am saying I want you to know it before you get your hopes up. End quote. I thanked her. I meant it. Not every person wearing a badge in that county was for sale, and I needed to remember that because in 6 more days I was going to need every honest one of them. That was the day I started sleeping in the tack room instead of the house, close enough to the horses to hear if the generator started again, close enough to the gate to hear a truck before it reached the barn. It was the day I unwrapped the leather cuff I always wore over my left forearm, looked at the old scar underneath, jagged, 11 years old, a story I hadn't and Oppo's T told anyone in this town and didn't and Oppo's T planned to start now and wrapped it back up. Old habits. You don and Oppo's T leave your weak points showing to people who are already looking for them. I didn't and Oppo's T know yet that Colton Briggs and Oppo's real weak point was that he and Oppo's D never once in his life met someone who and Oppo's D already survived something worse than him. 5 days before the hearing, I drove into town for feed and found Colton and 3 of his gym crew posted up outside the diner on Main, loud, laughing, blocking half the sidewalk. He saw me crossing the street and didn't and Oppo's T bother lowering his voice. End quote. There she is. County and Oppo's gonna fold that little charity op of hers by Friday, end quote, he said to his friends, but pitched exactly loud enough for me to hear every word. End quote. Should sell me the land now. Save herself the embarrassment. End quote. An older man at the next table, I recognized him vaguely, ran the feed store, glanced up sharply, then back down at his coffee, saying nothing. That was the temperature of Willow Fork that week. People saw. People didn't and Oppo's T say. I kept walking. Behind me I heard one of Colton and Appo's friends, the same thin, younger one from the truck, say something low that I couldn't, and Appo's catch and Colton and Appo's voice sharpen in response and quote, "What, you feel bad for her? She and Appo's had it coming since she opened her mouth to me." End quote. The kid didn't, and Appo's answer. 2 days before the hearing, my lawyer in Lexington called to say he and Appo's found something. A clerical inconsistency in the way the county had processed the retroactive fee, filed under emergency review instead of standard appeal, a designation that legally required 72 hours in Appo's public notice that Six Oaks had never received. It wasn't an Appo's a guaranteed win. But it was a crack, and cracks were something I understood how to use. I should have felt hope. Instead, that same afternoon, I found my mailbox smashed off its post and a note left on my porch rail, block letters and signed, "Last chance. Sign the easement release or something worse happens to your horses." I called Deputy Ruiz. I photographed the note. And that night, for the first time in 11 years, I took the old Ruger out of the gun safe in the tack room and set it on the shelf beside my cot, not because I planned to need it, but because a woman alone on 40 acres with 31 animals depending on her dozen and Appo's get to be sentimental about her own safety anymore. I was wrong about needing it in the end. What I needed instead were my hands, and everything a decade in rooms with no windows had taught them to do. The night it happened, I was checking the north fence line by flashlight when 3 sets of headlights turned up my drive at once, Colton and Appo's truck, and behind it 2 more trucks I didn't and Appo's recognize, engines cutting off in a loose semicircle around the barn. 6 men climbed out. I recognized 4 of them from the gym crowd. 2 were strangers, bigger, older, the kind of quiet, unbothered men who get paid by the hour to make problems disappear. End quote. Nora Callahan. End quote. Colton and Appo's voice easy, almost cheerful, carrying across the dark yard. End quote. Time and Appo's up. You had 9 days. You didn't, and Appo's sign. End quote. End quote. Get off my land. End quote. I didn't, and Appo's raise my voice. I never do, not when it matters. End quote. Here and Appo's what, and Appo's gonna happen. End quote. He walked closer, unhurried, flanked on either side, and I registered the geometry of it instantly, the way 6 men naturally spread to box a single body against a barn wall, a formation I had drilled 100 recruits through from the other side, teaching them exactly this maneuver against exactly this kind of target. End quote. You and Appo's gonna sign the release tonight in front of witnesses, and tomorrow this whole ugly business disappears. Or my associates here are gonna help you understand just how bad an accident can happen to a woman who lives alone with a barn full of flammable hay. End quote. That was the threat that mattered, not to me, but to the horses sleeping in their stalls 20 feet behind me, animals that had already survived starvation and neglect and had finally learned to trust that nothing else was coming for them. End quote. You and Appo's burned 31 animals. End quote. I said. End quote. To save yourself the cost of moving a fence. End quote. End quote. I and Appo's burned 32. End quote. He said and smiled. End quote. If you keep talking. End quote. The 2 strangers closed the last distance fast, and one of them caught my left arm before I and Appo's fully turned, wrenching it up behind me hard enough that something in my shoulder tore, a white-hot line of pain that dropped me to one knee on the gravel with a sound I hated myself for making. That was the first hit, the honest one, the one that told me these Warren and Appo's gym boys play acting toughness. These men had done this before, to someone else somewhere else, and knew exactly how much pain it took to make a body compliant. They zip-tied my wrists to the hitching post inside the barn door, rough enough to bruise, and that and Appo's where the story you already know begins, the plastic biting into my skin, the man crouched in front of me explaining patiently that nobody would miss me. I let my shoulders drop. I let my hands go loose. I counted exits and I counted men, and underneath the pain screaming through my dislocated shoulder, some old and very quiet part of me that hadn't and Appo's spoken in years finally woke back up. Here is the part one want to be honest about, because too many stories like this pretend the hero never bleeds. I was already hurt before the fight even started. My shoulder was out of socket. My wrists were raw and bleeding under the ties. I was 44 years old, out of practice and badly outnumbered, and for about 4 full seconds, crouched on that gravel floor with 6 men around me and my own barn smelling like hay and diesel and fear. I genuinely did not know if I was going to survive the next 5 minutes. Colton crouched in front of me again, closer this time. Close enough that I could smell the sports drink on his breath. End quote, you understand now, end quote. He said, not really a question, end quote, that this was never a fight you could win, end quote. I said nothing. I was doing math instead, shoulder, hands, distance, the exact angle of the post the ties were looped around, and the specific ugly fact that a zip tie and oppose, S weakest point ISN and oppose, T the plastic it and oppose, S the friction of the loop against itself and a joint that and oppose, S already dislocated has a strange, terrible gift. It can rotate through angles a healthy shoulder never could. I drove my bad arm down and back hard through the pain, feeling something grind and shift and scream through my whole left side. And the tie and oppose. S loop slid the half-inch of slack it needed against the worn wood of the post. My wrist tore free, skin peeling with it. I didn't and oppose. T have time to feel that yet. The man nearest me, the one who and oppose, D wrenched my arm, didn't and oppose. T register what had happened until my free hand was already moving, and by then it was too late for him to do anything but take the heel strike I drove up under his jaw. All the force I had left funneled through a joint of my own that was still grinding wrong in its socket. It wasn't an oppose, T clean. It wasn't an oppose. T the perfect effortless motion of a woman with 2 working arms. It connected hard enough to drop him, and hard enough that the pain of throwing it whited out my vision for a second afterward. And I stayed upright only because falling wasn't an oppose. T an option with 5 more men still standing. That was stage 1. I got hurt. I nearly didn't an oppose. T get back up. Stage 2 was uglier, slower, and far less certain than anything in the movies. A second man came in low trying to tackle me before I found my footing, and he half succeeded. We went down together against the stall boards, my bad shoulder taking the brunt of the impact, and for a moment I was just a woman on the ground with a man and oppose. S forearm across her throat, breath going thin, vision narrowing at the edges. I remember thinking with a strange calm clarity that this was how it happened. This was exactly how it always happened to soldiers, to victims, to anyone. Not a clean fight but a scramble, ugly and close and nearly lost. I found the only leverage I had left, my legs still free, and hooked one behind his knee and rolled my hips, using his own weight and momentum against him the way you learn to when you and oppose. V spent a decade being smaller than every man you trained. He went sideways off me and I got half a breath, and half a breath was enough. Stage 3 is the part where 11 years of training finally did what it was built to do. I got to my knees, then my feet, favoring the ruined shoulder, blood running warm down my forearm from the torn zip tie. And when the third man came at me with a wide looping punch, untrained, angry, the kind of swing a bar fight teaches you, not a dojo, I didn't and oppose. T block it. Blocking wastes time, you don and oppose. T have. I stepped inside the arc of it instead, closing distance instead of retreating from it, and drove the heel of my good hand up under his chin exactly the way I and oppose. D taught 119-year-olds to do it in a windowless room in Georgia a lifetime ago. He went down loose and boneless, out before he hit the dirt. Colton hadn't an oppose. T moved yet. He was watching, and for the first time all week I saw something on his face that wasn't an oppose. T contempt. It was confusion, sliding fast toward fear. The particular fear of a man who has spent his whole life believing his body made him untouchable and is only now, too late, understanding that it doesn't and oppose. T. End quote, what are you, end quote, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word. End quote. Someone who used to teach men exactly what you just watched, end quote, I said, and my own voice came out rough, breathless, nothing like a movie hero and oppose. S. End quote, for 11 years. Before you were old enough to walk into a gym. End quote. He came at me anyway because pride doesn't and oppose. T listened to fear the way it should, throwing a real technique this time, a takedown attempt with actual training behind it, hands shooting from my hips. I sprawled my weight backward and down, driving his face toward the gravel, and used my one good arm to lock around his throat from behind in the position I had drilled into recruits and oppose. Muscle memory 1,000 times over. Not to kill him, a distinction I want to be clear about, but to make him understand, completely and immediately, that the fight was already over. End quote. Stop, end quote, I said quietly, right against his ear, my ruined arm shaking with the effort of holding the position. End quote. Stop, and I let go. Keep fighting, and you black out on the floor of the barn you tried to burn. End quote. He stopped. His whole body went slack, the fight leaving him all at once the way it does when a person finally truly understands they and oppose. V lost. That was stage 4. Not triumph. Just relief and the sudden, overwhelming weight of everything I and oppose. D been holding back finally landing on me at once, the torn shoulder, the blood on my wrist, the last man still standing frozen by the truck, phone already out, calling 911 in a shaking voice because he, at least, had never actually wanted to be here. By the time Deputy Ruiz and Oppo's cruiser turned up my drive 12 minutes later, lights washing red and blue across the barn wall, I was sitting against the stall boards with my good hand pressed to my ruined shoulder, 3 men groaning on my barn floor, Colton zip-tied with his own crew and Oppo's plastic ties, and 31 horses somehow miraculously still calm in their stalls, as if they understood the danger had already passed. Ruiz took one look at the scene and didn't and Oppo's ask me a single question until the paramedics had my shoulder back in its socket and a blanket around my shoulders. When she finally crouched in front of me, her voice was gentle in a way I hadn't and Oppo's heard from her before. End quote. Nora. What happened here? End quote. I told her. All of it. The letter, the drain trough, the note on my porch, the 6 men and the threat against my horses. And this time with the physical proof lying groaning on my barn floor and a security camera I and Oppo's quietly installed over the tack room door 2 days earlier that had caught the entire thing on a loop, there was nothing left for anyone to wave away as a civil matter. Colton didn't and Oppo's stay quiet for long. Sitting on the gravel with his hands bound, humiliation finally catching up to the fear. He tried the only move he had left. And quote, she attacked us. Ask anyone. She and Oppo's been unstable since she moved back here. Everyone in town says so. End quote. The thin younger man, the one who and Oppo's looked back at me through the truck window that first day, spoke up before Ruiz had even finished writing it down. End quote. That and Oppo's not true. End quote. He said, voice shaking but steady. End quote. Colton set this whole thing up. The letter, the trough, the note, all of it. I was there when he told the lawyer to backdate the filing so she wouldn't and Oppo's get the notice period. End quote. He wouldn't and Oppo's look at Colton while he said it. End quote. I and Oppo's we got texts. I and Oppo's I'll show you everything. End quote. His name was Dallas Whitfield. He was 22 years old, had been Colton and Oppo's training partner since high school, and by morning he and Oppo's handed Deputy Ruiz a phone full of messages that turned a bad night in a barn into something much bigger than either Colton or I could have predicted. The county hearing happened anyway 5 days later, though by then it wasn't and Oppo's really about Six Oaks anymore. Dallas and Oppo's messages, combined with my documented pattern of harassment and the security footage, exposed exactly what my lawyer had suspected, that the end quote, emergency review end quote, designation on my variance had been requested directly by a county commissioner who golfed with Colton and Oppo's father twice a month, and that at least 2 prior complaints against Briggs Family Developments had been quietly shelved by the same commissioner over the past 3 years. The commissioner resigned before the hearing even opened, citing personal reasons that fooled nobody. The county attorney, visibly uncomfortable, stood up in front of a packed hearing room and formally apologized to me on the record. Not just for the improperly filed fee, which was voided entirely, but for what she called and quote, a pattern of the county and Oppo's failure to protect a resident who repeatedly and appropriately asked for help and quote. Deputy Ruiz sat in the back row through the whole thing, arms crossed, looking like she and Oppo's earned the right to that seat the hard way. Colton Briggs was charged with unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, and criminal harassment. His father and Oppo's lawyers got 2 of the 6 men lesser charges in exchange for testimony, but Colton himself, facing Dallas and Oppo's texts and my footage and 4 other men and Oppo's sworn statements, took a plea that kept him out of my county for the next several years and out of any martial arts gym in the state, permanently, after Ironclad and Oppo's actual owner, a broad-shouldered, silver-haired former Marine named Mac Doyle who and Oppo's let Colton half buy into the business 2 years earlier, showed up at my gate the following week. He didn't an Oppo's call ahead. He just stood at the fence, hat in hand, and told me he and Oppo's watched the footage 3 times before he could make himself believe what his own gym and Oppo's top student had done. End quote. I trained him 5 years end quote, Max said. End quote. Taught him respect right alongside the technique. Guess I taught the technique better. End quote. He and Oppos, D bought Colton and Oppos' half of the business back out from under him that morning at a loss just to sever the name from it entirely, and he asked quietly whether Six Oaks needed volunteers on weekends. He and Oppos, D grown up around horses, he said. Hadn't and Oppos, T touched one in years. I told him we always needed hands. What surprised me most wasn't and Oppos, T the arrest or the apology, or even Mac Doyle showing up hat in hand at my fence. It was what happened in town over the following 2 weeks. The slow, quiet unwinding of a silence that had sat over Willow Fork for months without my fully realizing how heavy it had gotten. The feed store owner who and Oppos, D looked away that day on Main Street came out to the ranch himself, unannounced, with a truck bed full of donated hay and an apology he clearly found difficult to say out loud. End quote. Should and Oppos, V said something that day. End quote. He told me, not quite meeting my eyes. End quote. Man like that, everybody in town was scared of what his father and Oppos' money could do to a business. Doesn't and Oppos, T excuse it. End quote. I told him it didn't and Oppos, T need to be excused, just fixed, and he came back the following week with 3 more truckloads and told half the county to do the same. Donations started arriving that I hadn't and Oppos, T asked for and hadn't and Oppos, T expected, checks from families I and Oppos, D never met, a fencing crew that showed up one Saturday morning and rebuilt the entire north pasture line for free because the foreman said his daughter had read about it online and made him promise. Priya and Oppos' mother who and Oppos, D never once come out to the ranch in the 2 years her daughter had volunteered there. Arrived with a casserole and stayed 3 hours asking questions about every horse by name. The county, in the wake of the commissioner and Oppos' resignation, opened a review into every land use complaint filed against Briggs Family Developments over the past 5 years. 2 other small landowners came forward with stories eerily similar to mine. Pressured buyouts, mysteriously expedited paperwork, threats that had never quite crossed the line into anything provable until now. Both cases were reopened. One elderly couple who and Oppos, D sold 40 acres under duress 2 years earlier at a fraction of its value got the county attorney and Oppos' office to pursue restitution on their behalf. Deputy Ruiz, for her part, was the one who finally told me. Off-duty, sitting on an overturned feed bucket in my barn aisle a week after the hearing, drinking coffee out of a chipped mug I and Oppos, D handed her, that watching my case get taken seriously had made her decide to run for sheriff in the spring. End quote. County and Oppos' had money running the show too long. End quote, she said. End quote. Figure somebody honest ought to try sitting in that chair instead. End quote. I told her I and Oppos' D vote for her twice if the county let me. Even Dallas Whitfield came back eventually 3 weeks later, standing awkwardly at my gate the way Mac Doyle had, asking if there was anything he could do to make it right. I didn't and Oppos' T trust him completely, not yet, but I remembered the way he and Oppos' D looked back at me through that truck window the very first day. The one flicker of decency in 6 men who and Oppos' D cornered a woman in her own barn. I put him to work rebuilding the trough Colton had drained, and he came back every Saturday after that without being asked twice. My shoulder took 11 weeks to heal properly, and some mornings even now, it aches when the weather turns before a storm. A small permanent reminder of the night I nearly didn't and Oppos' T walk out of my own barn. I don't and Oppos' T mind the ache honestly. It feels earned and it feels honest in a way that a body with no evidence of what it survived never quite would. Six Oaks is 38 horses now, 7 more than before, all of it running clean, the variants corrected and recorded properly for the first time in 60 years. Mac Doyle comes out most Saturdays and has gotten surprisingly good at mucking stalls for a man who spent 30 years breaking other men and Oppos' arms for a living. Dallas still shows up too, quieter than the rest, working harder than anyone else on the property like he and Oppos' trying to outrun something. Deputy Ruiz stops by sometimes on her patrol route off the clock, just to lean on the fence and watch the horses graze, and I think more than anything that and Oppos' what tells me this town finally came back to itself. I still keep the leather cuff over the scar on my forearm most days. Old habits dawn and Oppos' T leave just because the danger did. But some mornings now, mucking stalls in the cool gray light before sunrise, I catch myself leaving it off entirely. letting the old white line show in the sun without thinking twice about who might be watching. Nobody left in Willow Fork looks at that scar and sees a weakness anymore. They know now exactly what it means and exactly what it and oppose is capable of protecting when peace finally runs out of other options. The leaves are starting to turn gold along the fence line as I write this, and the horses are grazing easy in the morning cold, and for the first time in a long while, the only sound on this whole 40 acres is wind moving through the oaks my grandmother planted 60 years ago, and nothing at all worth being afraid of.